Hi, my name is Christian Maynard. I'm working on my PhD in sociology at Washington State University. I studied cannabis policy and adolescent use. And today we will examine a conservative commentator's opinion on cannabis legalization. Specifically, we will look at Charlie Kirk's take back in 2024. He is now deceased after a shooting incident. The video we'll take a look at today is Charlie Kirk shares his hot take on cannabis and alcohol with college student by Turning Point USA, published February 5th, 2024.
Hi, I know you're generally in favor of smaller governments. My question
Can you make sure you go right into the microphone? I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I know you're in favor in small government for a lot of issues. I know that drugs are a big issue in America. I was wondering, what was your perspective?
What college is this at? Does it say? If you know where this was at, let me know.
On recreational drugs in general, the legalization of drugs, and just what your perspective on that was?
Sure. The mass legalization of drugs has been a major mistake in our country. I used to be for it, and I've had a 180-degree reversal, and I'll tell you why. I believe in a small but strong government with...
One point that I found interesting is this take by Charlie. This is drug use or drug policy in the conservative movement is pretty interesting to me because you got the libertarian side that tends to be pro allowance of drugs, whereas you got more of the traditional or religious side of conservatism, which is in opposition to that viewpoint. In fact, Trump, the current president, had a similar take to that of Charlie's in the past. In April 1990, the Miami Herald published an article to beat drugs, make them legal, kill off profits, Trump declares. And in it, Trump declares we're losing badly the war on drugs. Trump said, you have to legalize drugs to win the war. You have to take the profit away from these drug czars. So yes, even then, the current president Trump was pro legalizing drugs. Let's continue.
Prudent and effective and, let's just say, common sense laws. I used to be one of those guys that was a conservative that said, if we really want to reduce government and make the cartels weaker, let's legalize weed, and that will really make the cartels weaker. And then we'll have less people in prison. Everything I believed was completely incorrect. Let me tell you.
From my understanding, this talking point is very common among the, like I said, the libertarian side of things, but specifically the Cato Institute in terms of a think tank.
Why. As we've legalized weed, especially in the American Southwest, we've seen more violent crime, not less. The cartels...
That's just not the case. Well, let's let it play out.
...are wealthier and stronger than ever before. One of the arguments was, well, kids now are going to be able...
Okay, well, that played out and did not clarify. So, he's saying that there's more crime, more violent crime specifically because of cannabis legalization. Well, let's take a look. Here's an article published in Justice Quarterly, The Cannabis Effect on Crime, time series analysis of crime in Colorado and Washington State. And in these results, they find that results indicate that marijuana legalization and sales have had minimal to no effect on major crimes in Colorado and Washington, and no statistically significant long-term effects with the initiation of retail sales on violent or property crime. Another article published in Crime Law and Social Change entitled Primary Crime-Related Outcome Indicators Associated with Recreational Cannabis Legalization, a comprehensive literature and data review. This article finds that cannabis-related crimes and enforcement have substantially decreased. The evidence for ecological effects on other types of crime is mixed. One other article that is worth mentioning is this Times article, which examined the U.S. legalization of cannabis and how it's affected Mexican cartels, which by and large, Mexican cartels are having to swap to different revenue sources to replace cannabis as it's now been legalized in many places. Let's continue.
not less. The cartels are wealthier and stronger than ever before. One of the arguments was, well, kids now are going to be able to not do harder drugs. That's not true. Kids are now getting into fentanyl and harder drugs earlier because whether or not we want to admit it, marijuana is a gateway drug. That is
A couple incorrect claims here. Let's take a look. First, let's take a look at cannabis use by adolescents. If this is the claim we're making, that legalization is somehow changing use. As you can see from the Monitoring the Future survey, which is a national survey of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders, use has remained relatively stable, if not experienced recent decreases. Now, Charlie mentioned fentanyl specifically, so let's take a look at fentanyl. Fentanyl in the past year by 8th, 10th, and 12th graders is incredibly rare. As you can see, we are talking about less than 1% of this age group. We're talking about a very micro amount of people in relative context. This is so small that it's really hard to determine blips either way at this point. In addition, Charlie mentions that it's a gateway drug. Let's talk about that aspect a bit more. So according to an article, Drug and Alcohol Review, is cannabis a gateway drug? Testing hypothesis about the relationship between cannabis use and the use of other illicit drugs. This was first published May 2009. Authors note that the affiliation of cannabis using peers may also interact with other drug using peers, and it may be more so about connections, the people you know. Moreover, for adolescents, the person who might sell cannabis is also the person who might sell other types of drugs. And association is not causation. Cannabis tends to be cheaper than most other drugs and more accessible at that age. Let's continue.
Is a true fact. Kids don't just start with fentanyl, they start with marijuana and it goes to other drugs, and we see that happen time and time again. So actually,
I mean, could you not make that claim on alcohol or tobacco or sugar? They're all drugs.
I believe that the decriminalization of weed has been something that actually makes government bigger. We now need more social workers. We now need more services. We're now giving more people.
I mean, what about the shrinkage on the criminal justice system, or the potential shrinkage with de-incarceration, the fact that mass incarceration is seemingly going down in recent years?
Things on welfare, money on welfare. And so while I understand the spirit and potentially the principle of legalizing or decriminalizing drugs, we have to look at the evidence. And the evidence is that we live in a sadder society, a more depressed society, a more anxious society, a more violent society. The more that drug...
We do not live in a more violent society. By and large, violent crime has either remained relatively stable or actually has decreased in recent years. And this is supported through victimization surveys as well.
Use has gone up over the last decade.
Oh, I see. Can I ask a follow-up question? I was wondering if, in what ways, you said that the cartel has become stronger with the legalization of marijuana. I was just wondering, what are the reasons for that?
Yeah, so they're no longer in the business of growing weed in the Sinaloa region, so now they traffic fentanyl in people.
Well, they're, like I said earlier, yes, the revenue sources are changing. And this brings up a really interesting point that if something is illegal, it does create an illegal market potentially around it, which would make that situation more dangerous.
Okay,
much more profitable and much more dangerous and murderous. So we basically told the cartel, stop trafficking the thing that actually wasn't as bad. It's bad, okay? And now they've gotten into really rich business where they get $5,000 a head when they traffic them across the Rio Grande Valley, and they're doing $5,000 a day.
Okay, so let's break this down. In terms of human trafficking, if that's the case, if they are making all this money, and you just said that legalizing cannabis has kind of cut into that, at least for that source of revenue, then what if you make the process for immigration very simple, very, it's paperwork at the end of the day. Therefore, and making it quick and efficient, therefore decreasing the incentive for the cartel. In addition, Charlie mentions about the smuggling of fentanyl by cartels, but it's not being done directly by cartels. In fact, most of the fentanyl that's being smuggled in is done by U.S. citizens. A study from fiscal years 2019 through June 2024 was 81% are U.S. citizens. Let's continue.
Or they get fentanyl trafficked in from China, that this much of fentanyl, like a salt grain of fentanyl, will kill your grandkid almost instantaneously. And so now the fentanyl is, the cartels are bigger and stronger than ever before. They're more brazen and bold than ever before. They're kidnapping and killing Americans. They're controlling the entire Mexican government. The border is now completely controlled by the cartel. And we were told that drug legalization would make the cartels irrelevant, the same way that the legalization of alcohol made the mob less powerful in the 30s. That was a lie, by the way. The mob just went into a different business, okay? It's not like they stopped committing violent crime, and it's just not true. The cartels are running the entire southwestern part of the border and many parts of the southwestern United States.
Last follow-up question with that. I see your point that the legalization of marijuana has increased drug use and has increased the demand for things like fentanyl and heroin and stuff. I was wondering, I guess, like, why is making things like alcohol illegal? But
this is another thing. Even this individual is saying, okay, I see your point that cannabis might, go into that gateway drug hypothesis. One thing that neither this individual nor Charlie brings up is the fact that seemingly when you legalize cannabis, opiate use is going down. Yes, maybe cannabis is a gateway away from opiate use. According to association between county-level cannabis dispensary counts and opiate-related mortality rates in the United States, panel data study, using CDC mortality data, they found that according to this estimate, an increase from 1 to 2 storefront dispensaries in a county was associated with an estimated 17% reduction in all opiate-related mortality rates. Another article, do medical marijuana laws reduce addictions and deaths related to painkillers, says the key to feature of medical marijuana law that facilitates a reduction in overdose death rates is a relatively liberal allowance for dispensaries. Let's continue.
Making things like marijuana illegal, why is alcohol more acceptable than marijuana, for example?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not exactly a big fan of alcohol. I actually think alcohol is a really bad drug, and we overly glamorize alcohol in our society. I think we'd do some good to actually limit alcohol intake. I think it would actually...
I tend to agree with that sentiment.
Make people's lives better, and I think we've way over socialized drinking in our country. Now that's a separate argument though, because that's making something that's currently legal illegal. We're talking about making something that's illegal legal, right? So those are two separate things. But if you were to say wave a magic wand and people would drink less in America, I'd say sign me up for that. Because I mean, if you look at the amount of DUIs, violent crime, if you look at domestic assault, alcohol is almost always involved, almost always. So I would say this, right now the question is on marijuana, and it has been proven right now to have massive externalities that are negative. Over 70,000 people died of fentanyl overdoses last year, right? And over 140,000 people die from the effects of alcohol every single year. Now, I'll be the most unpopular public commentator on the planet to argue for a ban or an abolition of alcohol, but let me just say this. Someone needs to have the courage to say the amount we drink in our country is bad for us, and it's making us deeply unhappy. Thank you.
So some details for that. Drinking, especially among adolescents, has continued to decrease over time. As you can see, drinking has gone way down in recent years among 12th, 10th, and 8th graders. A Gallup article found that Americans actually hit a record low. This isn't just adolescents, it's Americans overall. And by and large, Americans are actually drinking less in recent years. I found this video interesting and the person seemed very kind. But again, I find that, at least in this case, Charlie hyper focuses on some of the negatives associated with cannabis and doesn't really interact with the potential positive benefits that come from legalization. such as reduce government in terms of police force. If you'd like to support my work, please like, comment, and get subscribed. And if you'd like to support me directly, I do have a Patreon linked in the description below. Have a wonderful day.